The galaxy is old, its empires are powerful, and its wars are endless. Humanity stands. These are the Empyrean Chronicles.
First Contact Report. Ambassador Vel-Sareth, Council Diplomatic Corps, Sol System Mission, Preamble. I have filed hundreds of First Contact reports in my career. I have never filed one like this. Most reports follow a familiar structure. The subject species is cataloged, their technological level is assessed, their political situation is summarized, a recommendation is made, and the file is closed. The whole process for a civilization at the expected developmental stage rarely requires more than a few weeks of active engagement and several pages of documentation. This report required considerably more. What follows is my full account of the Sol System mission, the preparation, the observation period, the contact, the negotiations, the war, and my personal assessment of what humanity represents to the Council going forward. I have included details that would normally be condensed or omitted from a standard filing because I believe the Council requires the full picture to understand the significance of what has occurred. I also want to be transparent about my own errors of judgment throughout this process. I misread the situation at several key points. This report documents those failures as honestly as I can manage, because I think they reveal something important, not just about humanity, but about the assumptions the Council has been operating under for a very long time. I ask that this report be read in its entirety before any summary judgments are rendered. Background: the threat. The Council's first indication of the incoming fleet came from the long-range gravitational array maintained by the Vane Observatory Consortium. The initial readings were dismissed as background distortion. Deep space is full of gravitational noise, and the array had flagged false positives before. It was the pattern that eventually caught the attention of the analysts. Background distortion does not move in formation. Council intelligence identified the incoming civilization within 3 standard weeks. Cross-referencing with ancient records held by 3 of our oldest member civilizations confirmed what many had hoped they would not find. They are known in scattered records stretching back nearly 800,000 years by a designation that translates roughly as the Collectors. The records are fragmentary. Most civilizations that encountered them directly did not survive long enough to leave comprehensive accounts. But the consistent details across dozens of independent sources paint a clear picture. They do not conquer in the conventional sense. Conquest implies destruction, and destruction wastes resources. They collect, they process, they integrate. Entire star systems harvested of their sapient populations. Civilizations disassembled and repurposed as labor infrastructure. Species reduced to biological machinery. Not killed, simply redirected. Stripped of language, culture, autonomy, and identity. Left alive in a technical sense, and in no meaningful sense at all. The records suggested their fleet at peak operation numbered in the tens of thousands of vessels. What the gravitational array had detected appeared to be a mobilization on that scale. The Council convened an emergency session within 48 hours of confirmation. I was not present for that session. I was already en route to my previous assignment when the emergency recall arrived. I remember reading the briefing summary in my quarters and then sitting very still for a long time before I replied to acknowledge receipt. Every Council civilization received the same emergency directive within the week. Prepare defenses, warn neighboring species, and make contact with every potentially viable ally in range, regardless of their developmental classification. That last clause was the one that mattered. Regardless of their developmental classification. In other words, even the primitives. Initial briefing. When High Command assigned me specifically to the Earth mission, I will admit my reaction was not enthusiasm. I understood the logic. I have more first contact experience than most ambassadors currently active in the Corps. If any assignment required someone who could manage the volatility of an uncontacted civilization under extreme time pressure, it should probably be me. I still did not want the assignment. The Sol system had been on our passive observation list for decades, long enough to have accumulated a substantial file, but not long enough to have prompted any serious diplomatic consideration. I had skimmed the file once years ago. Blue planet, carbon-based bipedal civilization, several billion individuals, significant internal conflict, classified as primitive and unstable. The kind of world that generates interesting biology reports and little else. My mission coordinator, Exarch Dunveth, presented the assignment with the particular diplomatic neutrality she uses when she knows the recipient is going to find the news unwelcome. Every potential ally matters now, Vel-Sareth, even marginal ones. I understood what she was not saying. We were desperate. The Council had not faced an external military threat of this magnitude in living memory. Our member civilizations had evolved through long periods of stability. Our collective military capacity reflected that stability. We had enough to deter each other, to manage the occasional localized dispute, to handle the incidental dangers of deep space. We did not have enough to fight a harvesting fleet. We needed numbers. We needed warm bodies with weapons, planets with industrial bases, civilizations willing to commit to a war they might not survive. We needed everyone we could find, even the primitives at the edge of the Orion Arm. I accepted the assignment. I assembled my team. Threya as science officer, Commander Oreth as tactical advisor, a small diplomatic staff, and a first contact specialist named Vel-Sareth, who had worked 3 previous uncontacted civilizations and still had all her limbs. We set course for the unremarkable yellow star the humans call Sol. I expected to spend 2 weeks delivering a warning to a frightened, fractured civilization and filing a polite report about their limited defensive potential. I was wrong about almost everything. Approach and observation. Standard protocol requires observation before contact. We do not announce ourselves to a civilization before we understand, at minimum, their basic social structure, their likely response to the unexpected, and whether our presence will immediately cause a political crisis. We entered the Sol system at its outer boundary and spent 11 days running analysis. Threya led the biological assessment. She is not easily impressed. She has surveyed 63 worlds across 30 years of service and approaches new species with the clinical detachment of someone who has seen most of what biological evolution produces. When she submitted her preliminary report on the 3rd day, she attached a personal note I had never seen her include in 11 years of working together. Ambassador, I recommend you read the full data before we make contact. There are details I want to make sure you have absorbed. I read it immediately. The numbers were strange in ways that took me a moment to process. Human skeletal density ran roughly 30% higher than the Council baseline for bipedal species of comparable size and evolutionary age. Their musculature was dense in ways that did not correspond to their planet's gravitational profile, denser than it needed to be for their environment, as though their biology had retained adaptations from a more demanding ancestral context and simply never shed them. Their nervous systems processed threat response at speeds we typically associate with prey species from high predation environments. Their immune systems warranted a separate section of the report. Threya described them as aggressive and adaptive in ways that implied sustained exposure to a remarkable diversity of pathogens across evolutionary history. The human immune system does not simply resist infection. It catalogs it, learns from it, and prepares responses to variants it has never encountered. It is, she wrote, the immune system of a species that evolved in an environment that was actively trying to kill it. She included a note at the end of the biology section that I have thought about many times since. In isolation, each of these traits has an explanation. Together, they form a profile. They evolved on a hostile world, and their biology remembers it even though they appear to have largely domesticated that world. The question this raises is, what did they do with that capacity once the original threat was gone? The historical record answered that question. I had been warned that humans were a warlike species. The original classification file mentioned conflict. I had read the summary and formed the image most council diplomats form when they read such files. A relatively primitive civilization with underdeveloped conflict resolution, prone to the kind of localized violence that most species pass through on their way to something more stable. What the summary had failed to convey, what the flat bureaucratic classification of primitive and unstable completely failed to communicate, was the scale of it. Thousands of documented wars across their recorded history, not raids, not skirmishes between neighboring tribes, industrial-scale conflicts, wars fought with weapons capable of leveling cities, wars that mobilized entire continental economies toward a single purpose, killing as many of the enemy as possible, as efficiently as possible. Wars that killed millions, tens of millions, in some cases hundreds of millions. And yet humanity had never stopped. Not once in their recorded history had they stopped advancing. Every major conflict appeared to accelerate something. New technologies emerged from military necessity and spread into the general civilization. New organizational structures developed under the pressure of mass mobilization and became the template for peacetime institutions. New industries built to sustain war were repurposed to sustain recovery, then growth, then further expansion. They had turned their own violence into fuel. Commander Orion came to my quarters on the 8th day. He had not done this on any previous mission. He is not an informal person. Ambassador, I have run the predictive combat models against the historical data 4 times. I keep expecting to find an error. I asked him what the models showed. If these projections are accurate, and if humanity can be unified toward a single military objective, he paused. They may be the most effective combat species currently active in this galaxy, possibly the most effective in Council recorded history. I asked him to send the models to High Command immediately. Then I authorized contact. First contact. We transmitted on standard Council diplomatic frequencies. I used the simplified first contact protocol that the Corps has refined over centuries. Clear, non-threatening, informationally minimal. The kind of message designed to be understood by a civilization that has never spoken to anyone outside its own planet. We come from the Galactic Council. We bring a warning. We wish to speak with your leadership. We mean no harm. The response came in 4 minutes, not 4 hours, not 4 days, as is common with civilizations that need time to process the reality of what they are receiving, to convene emergency government sessions, to debate internally whether the signal is genuine. 4 minutes. Welcome. We have been expecting contact. Please identify your vessel type and preferred communication medium, and we will arrange a meeting. Threa looked at me. Orith looked at me. Vel-Sareth, my first contact specialist, who had spent considerable time preparing for the range of possible responses to our transmission, looked at her preparation notes and then set them aside. I transmitted a clarifying question. Please specify what you mean by expecting contact. The reply arrived almost immediately. We have been searching for signals of extraterrestrial origin for approximately 80 years. We have been detecting anomalous deep space activity consistent with non-natural phenomena for the past 3 years. We have been expecting that someone would eventually come to explain it. We are glad you did. I have made first contact with 11 civilizations. The responses have ranged from reverent awe to near-religious panic to one memorable incident involving a species that attempted to immediately open trade negotiations before we had finished our opening statement. None of them had been expecting me. For most species, the moment of first contact is the moment the universe becomes larger than they had imagined. Humanity, apparently, had been waiting for us to call. I requested a meeting. They offered us a secure orbital facility within the hour and asked whether we had any atmospheric or gravitational requirements they should accommodate. The orbital facility. The facility itself was informative before any conversation took place. It was, by the standards of most civilizations at Earth's developmental stage, considerably more sophisticated than it had any right to be. The external structure showed design principles consistent with a civilization that had been thinking seriously about long-duration space habitation for some time, not as an experimental project, but as a practical priority. The atmospheric controls were precise. The gravity plating, when we entered, was calibrated to a range that would accommodate a variety of species rather than just humans, as if they had designed the facility anticipating guests who might not share their biology. I mentioned this to Vel-Sareth as we docked. She said quietly, "They built this expecting to use it for exactly this purpose." I thought she was speculating. Later, one of the human scientists confirmed it. The facility had been constructed 7 years prior, with the explicit design brief of serving as a neutral meeting ground for potential extraterrestrial contact. They had not known when contact would come, or from whom. They had built the infrastructure anyway. The humans sent 4 representatives. A military general, a compact and weathered woman named Park, who had the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms where bad news is delivered. A civilian scientist, tall and restless, named Okafor, who spent much of our initial exchange studying my team with the open intensity of someone who has been waiting a very long time for this specific moment. A diplomat named Vasquez, who was smooth and careful and gave nothing away. And a 4th figure introduced simply as an advisor, a woman named Chen, who sat at the end of the table and said very little and watched everything. I made a note after the meeting that Chen was almost certainly their intelligence chief. I later learned I was correct. The meeting. We delivered our briefing in full. The incoming fleet, the collectors, the council's situation, the scale of the threat, the timeline, as best we had estimated it, the nature of what the collectors do to the civilizations they encounter. I watched the humans carefully as I spoke. I have delivered difficult information to many species, and the reactions tell you a great deal about the civilization you are dealing with. Fear is the most common response to existential threat, even from species that would never admit to it. Disbelief is nearly as common. Occasionally, there is a kind of paralysis. General Park showed none of these. Her expression did not change significantly from the moment I began speaking to the moment I finished. She was not suppressing a reaction. She simply did not appear to be having one. Okafor was making notes throughout, occasionally asking precise, clarifying questions about fleet composition and propulsion signatures that suggested he had already been thinking about this problem for some time. Vasquez nodded at appropriate intervals with the patient neutrality of someone reserving judgment. Chen watched me without expression and said nothing. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then Park spoke. "We know." I understood the words individually. Together, in that context, they did not initially compute. "I beg your pardon?" "We know about the fleet. Our deep space monitoring array detected the gravitational signature approximately 3 years ago. We have been analyzing the data since then." She set a data tablet on the table. The readings on the screen were, as far as I could tell at a glance, highly accurate. Okafor added, almost as an aside, "We did not know they were called the Collectors." That is useful context. I am aware that I sat in silence for several seconds. My staff later told me it was closer to 8 seconds. I believe them. My analyst was already working frantically behind me, pulling up the original Earth classification file, trying to reconcile what we had been told with what we were now being shown. The disconnect was significant. Earth's official technological profile, as assessed by Council observational teams years prior, was substantially below what was now being described. I asked the obvious question, how? Park answered without embarrassment. They had been building deep space monitoring infrastructure for decades, she explained, originally in response to their own internal strategic concerns. They were watching each other initially, as much as they were watching the sky. But the technology, once developed, served both purposes. And when you build sensors capable of detecting the activities of rival nations at interplanetary distances, you eventually start detecting things that are not rival nations. "We have been aware for some time that we were not alone," Park said. "We simply did not know whether anyone was interested in making that mutual." I asked about their military capacity. She looked at Chen, who gave a small nod. What followed was a 40-minute briefing that I will summarize here. Orbital defense platforms, kinetic delivery systems with ranges and payloads substantially beyond what our observational teams had estimated. A fleet of experimental faster-than-light capable warships, not fully operational, still in late-stage trials, but further along than we had believed possible for a civilization that had not, to our knowledge, had contact with species possessing that technology. I asked how they had developed faster-than-light drive without external technical assistance. Okafor smiled slightly. They had inferred it, he explained. The observational data they had been accumulating for decades included the signatures of Council vessels transiting the outer system. They had worked backward from what they could detect. They had reverse-engineered faster-than-light theory from sensor readings of ships they had never seen and whose operators had no idea they were being studied. But the detail that stayed with me most was not the weapons platforms or the warships or the drive research. It was the industrial capacity. Earth had, over the previous century, built an industrial infrastructure of remarkable scale and redundancy. Not because they had planned for alien invasion, though the possibility had apparently been taken seriously by a number of their strategic planning bodies, but because they had been building for war with each other. And that kind of infrastructure, once built, does not simply disappear when the immediate threat recedes. It persists, it expands, it finds new purposes. They were not a civilization that had recently become aware of a threat and begun responding to it. They were a civilization that had never stopped responding to threats, and happened to now be pointed at the right one. The question. Before we moved to formal negotiations, I asked the question that had been forming since the moment Park said, "We know." Why have you not contacted the Council? You have been aware of extraterrestrial civilization for some time. You have had the capability to transmit. Why have you waited? There was a pause. It was Park who answered, and she answered simply, "You never contacted us." I had no immediate response to that. Vasquez elaborated more gently. They had debated the question internally for decades. They had detected Council vessels. They had known the Council existed in some form. They had weighed the costs and risks of announcing themselves to a civilization they did not understand, whose intentions they could not assess, whose response to their existence was unknown. "We are a species with a complicated relationship with first contact," Vasquez said. "Our own history contains many examples of what happens when a more technologically advanced civilization encounters a less advanced one. We were aware of those precedents when we considered announcing ourselves. The implication was not lost on me. They had been watching us for years and had decided, based on our observed behavior and their own historical experience, that announcing themselves to an unknown and more powerful civilization was a significant risk. They had chosen to observe, develop their own capabilities, and wait to see whether we would approach them. They had, in other words, behaved exactly as a cautious and sophisticated civilization would behave when it has reason to be cautious. This is when I began to revise my fundamental assessment of humanity. Not because of the weapons, not because of the research, because of the patience, because a species that had the capability to shout into the dark and had chosen instead to listen, to learn, to prepare. That species was not primitive. That species was careful. And careful in the context of a galaxy that had just produced a harvesting fleet was a great deal more valuable than any number of weapons platforms. The negotiation. The formal talks lasted 6 hours. Humanity agreed to contribute militarily to the Council's defense. This decision was reached quickly. Park indicated that the internal authorization had been prepared in advance of our arrival, contingent on the nature of the contact. There was no agonized debate about the ethics of intervention, no lengthy discussion of political risk. They had one condition. I had anticipated the kinds of conditions that civilizations in their position typically raise: guarantees of sovereignty, assurances against Council interference in internal affairs, trade arrangements, technology exchanges. These are the standard currencies of defensive alliances, and I had prepared positions on all of them. Instead, Park looked at me directly and said, "The Council must not simply defend the Milky Way. If we fight alongside you, we fight to liberate the civilizations already enslaved in the neighboring galaxy. That has to be part of the commitment." I told her I would transmit the condition to High Command. The Council debated for 9 hours. Many member species are genuinely, constitutively peaceful, not as a political stance or a cultural preference, but as something closer to a biological orientation. The concept of projecting military force beyond the immediate defensive necessity was deeply uncomfortable in ways that went beyond strategic calculation. Several ambassadors argued the condition was unreasonable, that it exceeded what the situation required, that accepting it would commit the Council to an open-ended military campaign in another galaxy with no defined endpoint. I relayed these objections to Park. She listened to all of them. "Tell me something," she said. "When the slavers come back, and they will come back, because you have something they want and you will have failed to cost them enough to make them reconsider, what is your plan?" I relayed the question. The Council debated for another hour. Then they agreed. The agreement was signed. Humanity joined the Galactic Council. Their membership was formally ratified within 36 hours, the fastest ratification in Council history. I remember thinking, as the ceremony concluded, that we had come to offer humanity a warning and a chance to help us. It had not entirely gone that way. Preparations. The period between the signing and the arrival of the collector fleet lasted approximately 4 months. I remained on Earth for much of it, coordinating between Council command structures and human military leadership. It was a disorienting experience in ways I did not fully anticipate. I had expected the logistics of integration to be the primary challenge. 2 military establishments that had developed in complete isolation from each other, with no shared doctrine, no common communication protocols, no mutual understanding of each other's operational concepts, merging them under active time pressure. I thought this would be the dominant problem. It was not. The humans adapted to shared protocols with unnerving speed, and where they could not adapt, they improvised workarounds that frequently improved on the original system. The disorienting experience was something else. It was watching a civilization prepare for war. Not the way Council civilizations prepare for war, carefully, reluctantly, with considerable political deliberation and an ongoing effort to also pursue diplomatic alternatives. Humans prepare for war the way they appear to prepare for most large undertakings, with totality. Industries that had been producing one thing began producing another. Facilities that had never been used for military purposes were converted with startling efficiency. The question of whether to prepare was never raised. Only the question of how. Commander Oreth spent many of those 4 months embedded with human military planners, and his reports back to me were increasingly enthusiastic in a way that made me mildly concerned about his objectivity. He was not wrong in his assessments, though. The humans were very good at this. They were not, I should note, without internal tensions during this period. Their political divisions did not disappear simply because an external threat had arrived. There were difficult negotiations among human governments, disputes about resource allocation, controversies about command authority. Human political life is loud and contentious and produces a volume of disagreement that can, from the outside, look like dysfunction. Park addressed this directly during one of our coordination meetings. "We argue about everything," she said. "We have always argued about everything. That has never once stopped us from doing what needed to be done." I believed her. The preparations continued. The war. When the collector fleet finally reached the Milky Way boundary, they had presumably refined their expectations about what they would find here. Their records, from what we later recovered and translated, indicated they expected a collection of relatively minor civilizations with limited defensive coordination. They expected some resistance. They did not expect to significantly alter their operational approach. The first engagement lasted 47 minutes before the collector vanguard retreated. Council fleets performed their roles well. The coordination and fire control and defensive positioning that centuries of military theory had produced. Shield ships held. Support vessels maintained the lines. The strategic architecture functioned as designed. But the human warships at the front of the formation did something the Council strategic models had not predicted, because no Council military theorist had thought to include it in a model. When the collector vanguard began to pull back after the initial exchange, the humans pursued them. Not defensively, not to prevent a flanking maneuver. They pursued the retreating vanguard into open space at maximum velocity, firing continuously, and drove them back into their own formation, which caused a cascading disruption that the collectors needed several hours to reorganize from. Several Council admirals transmitted concerns about this tactic. It was aggressive beyond what the defensive mandate seemed to require. It exposed the human warships to fire from multiple directions. From a conventional strategic standpoint, it was not the correct thing to do. General Park, informed of these concerns, responded that she was aware of that, and that the point was not to do the correct thing, but to do the unexpected thing. Because an enemy that does not know what to expect from you cannot effectively plan for you. The collectors did not know what to expect from humanity. This turned out to matter enormously. The collectors had conquered hundreds of civilizations. They had done so through a combination of overwhelming numerical superiority and a systematic approach to breaking resistance. Destroy enough infrastructure that supporting the population becomes the primary concern, wait for the defensive capacity to redirect toward humanitarian crisis management, then collect at reduced resistance. It was efficient. It had worked reliably for centuries. It did not work against humans. Humanitarian crises did not appear to redirect human military capacity. If anything, the pattern in the historical record suggested the opposite. Humans under conditions of existential pressure did not redirect toward survival management. They redirected toward the source of the threat, with increased intensity and reduced concern for conventional strategic constraints. Human commanders used tactics that Council observers described as unpredictable, and that I would describe more precisely as relentlessly oriented toward a single outcome, making the enemy afraid, not just defeated, afraid. Ambushes at extreme range, decoys that drew fire onto collector command ships, close-range assault runs against targets that conventional doctrine would have identified as too well defended to engage directly. Entire formations sacrificed tactical advantage in order to close to ranges where human kinetic weapons outperformed collector energy systems. Over the course of the war, which lasted approximately 6 months of active engagement, the collector fleet lost a third of its vessels. Human losses were proportionally higher than Council losses, because human commanders consistently accepted higher risk assignments than Council commanders were asked to take. I raised this with Park at one point, mid-campaign. "The risk distribution seems inequitable," I said, as diplomatically as I could manage. "Human forces are consistently absorbing a disproportionate share of the dangerous engagements." She considered this for a moment. "We're better at it," she said finally. "Not because we're better soldiers, because we're more comfortable with the uncertainty. Your people are good at executing known tactics against known threats. We're good at finding out what works in situations where no one has done this before. Different tools for different problems. I found this difficult to argue with and did not try. The turning point. The decisive engagement came in the 4th month. Council intelligence had identified the Collector Command Nexus, the cluster of vessels from which fleet-wide coordination was managed. Destroying it would not end the campaign, but it would fragment the Collector fleet into regional components that could be addressed more manageably. The problem was that the Command Nexus was positioned at the center of the Collector formation, protected by multiple defensive layers. Any direct approach would be detected and responded to long before a strike force could reach effective range. 3 Council admirals presented plans. All 3 were tactically sound. All 3 relied on attrition, degrading the outer defensive layers over time until the inner layers could be engaged. The shortest of the 3 plans estimated this would take 6 weeks. Park presented a 4th plan. It took 3 days and used the human warships as the primary strike element. The Council admirals objected, strenuously and in detail, that the 4th plan required accepting casualty rates that were unacceptable. Park asked what the casualty rates for a 6-week attrition campaign would be across the combined fleet. There was a calculation period. Then there was a vote, and the 4th plan was approved. The Collector Command Nexus was destroyed on the 3rd day of the operation. Human losses were significant. The Collector fleet, deprived of central coordination, began fragmenting almost immediately. The retreat began within 2 weeks. Outcome. The Collector Armada retreated across the galactic boundary in a condition that the Council's post-engagement analysis described as functionally non-operational. They had lost roughly 1/3 of their total fleet strength. Their command infrastructure had been destroyed. Human warships pursued them well beyond the galactic boundary, past what the defensive mandate required, until Park was satisfied that the pursuit itself had been seen and recorded and would be remembered. When I asked her why the pursuit needed to extend so far, she gave me an answer I have thought about many times since. Because the next time someone looks at this record and thinks about whether to come here, I want them to think about what it cost the last group that tried. Distance is deterrence. You chase them all the way home or you haven't finished the message. The Council held. Every Council civilization survived the campaign intact. The official post-war assessment concluded what every individual debrief, every after-action review, every private conversation with Council commanders had already established. Without humanity, the Milky Way would have been harvested. This is not a rhetorical conclusion. It is the output of the modeling done by the Council's Strategic Analysis Division, cross-referenced with the historical record of the Collector fleet's previous campaigns. The defensive architecture the Council could have assembled without human participation would have held for a time and then broken. The Collectors had faced comparable resistance before and had developed the operational patience to outlast it. What they had not faced before was humans, and they had not been prepared for it. Aftermath. Earth received full Council membership, ratified unanimously. The first unanimous ratification vote in 700 years. A permanent seat on the High Council, and a formal designation that has no real precedent in Council history. Primary military partner, which is the Council's way of acknowledging that human forces are now the principal combat element of our collective defense architecture. The first joint operation is already in planning stages. Not a defensive posture, a liberation campaign into the neighboring galaxy, directed at the civilizations the Collectors have held for generations. This has generated significant debate among Council members. Several Council civilizations are uncomfortable with what this campaign represents. They have spent thousands of years building a civilization oriented around stability, mutual security, and the peaceful resolution of conflict. They did not join the Council to become a military power with an expeditionary mandate. These concerns are legitimate, I do not dismiss them, but I also remember what Park said early in the negotiations: what is your plan for when they come back? It was not a rhetorical question. It was a real one, and the Council did not have a good answer. There are civilizations in the neighboring galaxy that have been enslaved for centuries. We do not know how many. We know only that they are there, and that until now, no one in this galaxy has had the will or the capacity to go and get them. Humanity has both. I find myself unexpectedly not uncomfortable with this. Personal assessment. I was asked, in my debrief with Exarch Dunveth upon returning to Council space, to summarize my assessment of humanity in a single sentence. This is a standard debrief format, designed to force clarity about the essential finding. I told her I could not do it in one sentence. She told me to try anyway. I thought about it for a long moment and then said, Earth was not primitive. It was patient. What I mean is this. The Council looked at Earth for decades and saw a warlike, politically fragmented species with internal conflicts that seemed to preclude stable development. And that assessment was not entirely wrong. Humanity is all of those things. Their history is genuinely violent. Their politics are genuinely contentious. They have caused each other tremendous suffering across their recorded history. But we saw those things and concluded, primitive, underdeveloped, not worth the effort. What we missed was everything else. The persistence, the adaptability, the willingness to build infrastructure for contingencies decades before the contingency materialized. The biological and psychological capacity to function effectively under conditions that would incapacitate most Council species. The ability to take everything their own history had produced, the violence, the suffering, the constant conflict, and convert it into capability. They are not, in the end, a warlike species that has been lucky enough to survive its own aggression. They are a species that survived a difficult world and a difficult history, and emerged from both with tools that the rest of the galaxy did not have and did not know it needed. We classified them as primitive because we were looking for the signs of advancement we recognize: stable governance, low conflict rates, mature diplomatic institutions. On those metrics, humanity scores poorly. We were not asking the right questions. The right question, I now think, is not, how advanced is this civilization by the standards we recognize? The right question is, what can this civilization do that others cannot? What has their particular path, however difficult, however different from our own, produced in them that is genuinely irreplaceable? In humanity's case, the answer is the willingness to go into the dark after the thing that is hunting you and keep going until the hunting stops. We needed that. We did not know we needed it. We are fortunate they were here. Closing remarks. I want to end this report with something that is not, strictly speaking, within the standard scope of a first contact filing. Before I left Earth following the end of the campaign, General Park and I had a final meeting, unofficial, not part of any formal proceeding. We shared a meal together, which is a human ritual I have come to appreciate, and which involves a level of informal conversation that Council diplomatic protocol would not normally permit at this stage of an alliance. At one point, she asked me what I had thought when I first read the Earth file, before the mission, before any of this. I told her the truth. I had thought it was going to be a marginal assignment, a box to check, a warning delivered to a species that probably could not do much about it. She laughed, not unkindly. We thought the same thing about the Council when we first detected your ships. Some kind of advanced civilization out there never getting in touch. We figured you had decided we were not worth the trouble. I asked her if she had been angry about that. She thought about it. No. We figured if you ever decided we were worth talking to, we wanted to be ready. So we got ready. I have thought about that exchange more than anything else from the mission. A civilization that believed it had been overlooked and responded to that belief not with resentment or resignation, but with preparation. That spent decades getting ready for a conversation that might never have happened. That built the orbital facility and the deep space arrays and the warships and the industrial base, all against the possibility that one day someone would knock on the door and need something. Earth was not primitive. Earth was not overlooked by accident. We made a judgment about what they were based on what we expected to find, and we were wrong. And the galaxy is better for our having been wrong. I will not make that kind of judgment again. I recommend that the Council undertake a systematic review of all civilizations currently classified as primitive or pre-contact, with particular attention to those whose developmental profiles do not conform to expected patterns. We may have overlooked others. Given what is out there, we cannot afford to continue doing so. This concludes my report. Ambassador Vel-Sareth, Council Diplomatic Corps.
If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of humanity rising among the stars, please like, comment, and subscribe. New stories are released regularly here on Empyrean Chronicles.